This was supposed to be an easy arrest. 2 officers lied, planted evidence, and sent an innocent man to jail. Then, the truth came out in court. It starts like any other night. A stretch of highway, flashing red and blue in the mirror, the kind of stop that happens every day in America. Darius King pulls his car to the side of the road, keeping both hands on the wheel. He's been through this before too many times. He exhales, watching the 2 officers in the cruiser behind him, taking their time. They're talking, smirking. Then, the doors swing open. Officer Logan Banks leads the way. He's in his mid-40s, built like an old linebacker, with the kind of arrogance that comes from knowing he runs this town. Behind him, his partner, Officer Chris Doyle, a younger cop but just as bad, maybe worse. Darius doesn't argue, doesn't ask questions. He just hands over his license and registration. He knows how this goes. Where you headed? Banks asks, flipping through the documents like he's looking for a reason to be offended. Home. Where's that? Cincinnati. Doyle leans in a bit too far. Bit far from home, aren't you? Darius doesn't answer. He knows what's happening. They're stretching this out, feeling him out, trying to get a reaction. Mind stepping out of the car for me? Banks says. But it's not a request. Darius glances at the dash cam in their cruiser. Already recording. He could refuse. He has that right, but he also knows how that plays out. He steps out. Banks pats him down, taking his time. Then Doyle starts searching the car without permission. Darius keeps his mouth shut, eyes forward. Then, like clockwork, Doyle straightens up, holding a small bag of powder between his fingers. A smug grin spreads across his face. Well, Doyle says, shaking his head. Guess we got ourselves a problem. Darius doesn't flinch, doesn't blink. Inside, his mind is racing. He knows that bag wasn't in his car. But Banks just sighs like this is another routine cleanup. Shame you had potential. Banks mutters, and just like that, the cuffs are on tight, unnecessary. Doyle whispers as he shoves Darius toward the cruiser. You're done, boy. Darius exhales slowly, biting back his reaction. They have no idea who they just arrested. But they're about to find out inside the station. It's the same old routine. Paperwork, fingerprints, a cold metal bench. Darius sits in the holding cell, hands resting loosely on his lap. No panic, no anger, just patience. On the other side of the bars, Banks and Doyle share a laugh over stale coffee. Another one bites the dust. Doyle mutters, stirring sugar into his cup. Banks leans against the counter, stretching like he just wrapped up a long day's work. Probably thought he was going to talk his way out of it. He chuckles. They always do. They don't even look at Darius. To them, he's just another number, another easy win. But Darius, he's waiting. His lawyer arrives within the hour, faster than expected. Tall, composed, dressed in a sharp gray suit. Elijah Monroe walks in like he owns the place. He barely acknowledges the officers, heading straight for his client, Darius. He says evenly, "You all right?" Darius nods. Elijah turns to Banks and Doyle, his expression unreadable. "You boys have an airtight case, I assume?" Doyle smirks. "Oh, it's locked down. We got the drugs, we got the body cam footage, and we got his prints." Elijah's gaze sharpens, like he's just heard a bad joke. "His prints?" Banks shrugs. "All over the bag." Elijah exhales, rubbing his chin. "Right." He glances at Darius, who remains calm, too calm. The kind of calm that should have made these cops nervous. But they don't see it. Not yet. Instead, Banks tosses a file onto the desk with a smug grin. "We'll see you in court, counselor." Elijah picks up the folder, flipping through it casually before shutting it with a soft thud. Then, with a final glance at Darius, he nods. It's about to get real interesting. They don't know it yet, But they just walked into a fight they can't win. The courtroom is packed. Reporters fill the back rows. Cameras flashing. Outside the doors. The media has picked up the case overnight. Another drug bust in Ohio. Just another headline. Banks and Doyle sit at the prosecution's table. Straight-backed. Confident. It's their word against his. Open and shut. Darius sits beside Elijah. Still calm. Almost bored. The prosecutor, Rachel Vaughn, a sharp but overworked attorney, steps forward. Your Honor. She begins. The state will prove that on the night in question, the defendant, Darius King, was in possession of an illegal substance with intent to distribute. She paces, holding up a plastic evidence bag. The cocaine. These drugs were found in his vehicle, and his fingerprints were all over the bag. The arresting officers, both highly respected, will testify. This was supposed to be an easy arrest. 2 officers lied, planted evidence, and sent an innocent man to jail. Then, the truth came out in court. It starts like any other night. A stretch of highway, flashing red and blue in the mirror, the kind of stop that happens every day in America. Darius King pulls his car to the side of the road, keeping both hands on the wheel. He's been through this before too many times. He exhales, watching the 2 officers in the cruiser behind him, taking their time. They're talking, smirking. Then, the doors swing open. Officer Logan Banks leads the way. He's in his mid-40s, built like an old linebacker, with the kind of arrogance that comes from knowing he runs this town. Behind him, his partner, Officer Chris Doyle, a younger cop but just as bad, maybe worse. Darius doesn't argue. Doesn't ask questions. He just hands over his license and registration. He knows how this goes. Where you headed? Banks asks, flipping through the documents like he's looking for a reason to be offended. Home. Where's that? Cincinnati. Doyle leans in a bit too far. Bit far from home, aren't you? Darius doesn't answer. He knows what's happening. They're stretching this out. Feeling him out. Trying to get a reaction. Mind stepping out of the car for me? Banks says. But it's not a request. Darius glances at the dash cam in their cruiser. Already recording. He could refuse. He has that right. But he also knows how that plays out. He steps out. Banks pats him down, taking his time. Then Doyle starts searching the car without permission. Darius keeps his mouth shut, eyes forward. Then, like clockwork, Doyle straightens up, holding a small bag of powder between his fingers. A smug grin spreads across his face. Well, Doyle says, shaking his head. Guess we got ourselves a problem. Darius doesn't flinch, doesn't blink. Inside, his mind is racing. He knows that bag wasn't in his car. But Banks just sighs like this is another routine cleanup. Shame you had potential. Banks mutters, and just like that, the cuffs are on tight, unnecessary. Doyle whispers as he shoves Darius toward the cruiser. You're done, boy. Darius exhales slowly, biting back his reaction. They have no idea who they just arrested. But they're about to find out inside the station. It's the same old routine. Paperwork, fingerprints, a cold metal bench. Darius sits in the holding cell, hands resting loosely on his lap. No panic, no anger, just patience. Elijah watches the courtroom, his gaze steady as the tension builds. The prosecutor proceeds, moving from witness to witness, until it's Banks' turn. He takes the stand confidently, his voice steady, rehearsed. It was a routine stop. The suspect was acting suspicious. So we searched the car. That's when we found the drugs, Banks says, his eyes scanning the room. But Elijah doesn't flinch. No reaction. The prosecutor continues. And did the suspect resist? Banks shakes his head. No, but he knew he was caught. That's why he didn't fight back. Elijah leans forward slightly, tilting his head as he processes the words. Interesting choice of words. he mutters under his breath, but loud enough for Banks to hear. Doyle's turn arrives next, and he stands with an air of cocky confidence. I've been in law enforcement for 8 years, and I know a guilty man when I see one, he declares. Locking eyes with the jury, Elijah can't help but chuckle quietly, just enough to catch Doyle's attention. The prosecutor frowns. Something funny, Mr. Monroe? Elijah smiles and leans back in his chair. No, please, continue. The prosecutor sighs. Officer Doyle, are you certain the evidence was handled properly? Absolutely. Doyle responds, his voice unwavering. From the moment I found it to the moment it was logged in. Elijah, finally sitting forward, gives Doyle a long, deliberate look. Officer Doyle, you've made a lot of arrests, haven't you? Doyle nods. Yes, and in all those cases. Have you ever made a mistake? Doyle shifts uncomfortably. I do my job right. Elijah smiles. Just a hint of amusement in his expression. I see. So, when you searched my client's car, did you have probable cause? Doyle blinks. Thrown off. He was acting nervous. Elijah nods. Did he refuse to comply? No. Doyle replies. And yet, you searched the car anyway. Without consent. Without a warrant? Elijah's words hang in the air. Doyle's jaw tightens. We had reasonable suspicion. Elijah turns to the judge. Your Honor, I move to suppress the evidence on the grounds of an illegal search. The courtroom murmurs. Banks shifts uncomfortably in his seat. The judge sighs. Noted. Mr. Monroe, continue. Elijah picks up the evidence bag slowly, turning it over in his hands. Studying it. You said my client's fingerprints were all over this bag. Officer Doyle? He asks. His voice calm. Doyle nods. Correct. Elijah raises an eyebrow. And yet his prints weren't found inside the bag. Can you explain that? The jury perks up as Doyle blinks. Elijah steps closer. How do you explain that? Doyle swallows. A nervous tick in his throat. Maybe he was wearing gloves. Elijah smirks. A quiet but confident laugh escaping. So, now you're saying he was smart enough to wear gloves, but dumb enough to leave the bag in plain sight? Doyle shifts in his seat. Uncomfortable. Elijah drops the bag back onto the table. No further questions. Banks and Doyle exchange a glance. This was supposed to be easy. But the problems are just beginning. The atmosphere in the courtroom has shifted. The tension is thick. Everyone sits a little straighter in their chairs. The energy palpable, but Elijah Monroe isn't finished. He stands up, adjusting his suit with an air of confidence. Walking toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he begins. We've heard a lot today from 2 officers who claim this was an open and shut case. That my client, an educated man with no prior record, just happened to have a bag of drugs in his car. He pauses, letting the weight of his words sink in. But here's what they didn't tell you. Elijah steps over to the defense table and picks up a thin folder. Nothing flashy, just a few sheets of paper. My client, he says, glancing at Darius before returning his gaze to the jury, is not just some random man driving through Ohio. The room goes silent. Banks and Doyle exchange a quick glance. Elijah flips open the folder. Darius King is a federal agent. A ripple of gasps spreads through the room. The prosecutor's eyes widen. Banks leans forward, shocked. That's not possible. Elijah doesn't even look at him. Specifically, he continues. An operative with the Central Intelligence Agency. The room erupts. The judge bangs his gavel. Order, order, for the first time. Darius looks at the officers. And Elijah can see the fear in their eyes. Elijah raises his voice just enough to be heard over the murmurs. My client was working an undercover operation, deep in a classified assignment when he was stopped. And instead of following proper protocol, these 2 officers decided to play judge. Jury and executioner. The prosecutor stands, her face pale. Your Honor, the defense needs to provide proof of these claims. Elijah smiles. Glad you asked. He reaches into the folder, pulling out a sealed document stamped with the CIA's insignia. These are classified records, just recently declassified for the purpose of this trial. They confirm my client's employment, his mission, and the fact that he was operating under federal protection at the time of his arrest. Banks and Doyle are frozen. The prosecutor sits down. Stunned, Elijah places the documents back in the folder, looking at the judge, then back at the jury. This isn't just about drugs. This is about power, authority, and the trust we place in those sworn to serve and protect. But when that trust is betrayed, we must all pay attention. Document this carefully on the evidence table, he says, stepping back. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you, does this sound like a man who's carrying drugs to sell? Or does this sound like two officers who thought they could frame someone they assumed had no power? The jury is still. Some stare at the officers, some at Darius, and for the first time, Banks and Doyle understand, they just lost. But their problems are far from over. Banks is sweating. Doyle's jaw is clenched so tightly it looks like it might crack. Everything they thought they controlled is slipping fast. Elijah takes a slow turn toward the judge. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, we request that all charges against my client be dropped immediately. The prosecutor doesn't even argue. She knows there's no coming back from this. The judge exhales heavily, then nods. Motion granted. Mr. King, you are free to go. Relief washes over the courtroom. Darius leans back, rolling his shoulders. But Elijah isn't done, not yet. Oh, one more thing, he says, turning toward the prosecution. We'd like to enter new evidence into the record. The room falls still. Elijah pulls a USB drive from his pocket and holds it up. This contains surveillance footage that my client's agency has access to. Doyle shifts in his seat. That's not possible. We turned off our body cams. Elijah chuckles. Yeah, you did. He turns to the jury. But the gas station across the street didn't. Banks sucks in a sharp breath. Elijah inserts the drive into a laptop. The courtroom screen flickers to life. And there it is, crystal clear footage from across the street. It shows Doyle reaching into his pocket, pulling out a small bag, glancing at Banks before placing it under the driver's seat. The courtroom explodes with gasps and shocked murmurs. Doyle stands up so fast his chair topples. This is manipulated, he yells. Elijah raises a brow. Really? Because this was time-stamped and pulled directly from the station's external security feed. Banks looks at Doyle. His face pale. You told me the cameras weren't angled that way. Doyle shakes his head. Panic in his eyes. They weren't. I didn't. Elijah crosses his arms. So now you're saying you planted the drugs. But you didn't think you'd get caught? Silence. Doyle is stuck. The judge turns to the bailiff. Take these men into custody. The same handcuffs that were slapped onto Darius click shut around their own wrists. Banks tries to argue, but the words catch in his throat. Doyle just stares ahead, hollow, like he can't believe this is happening. Darius stands, straightening his shirt. He walks past them slowly, stopping just for a moment. Doyle won't meet his eyes. Banks barely whispers, "Who the hell are you?" Darius smirks. Just a guy going home. But for Banks and Doyle, home is about to look a lot like a prison cell. The courtroom is still buzzing as Banks and Doyle are led away in handcuffs. Cameras flash. Reporters whisper. This wasn't the story they expected to cover. Outside, the air is different, crisp, free. Darius steps onto the courthouse steps. Elijah by his side. How you feeling? Elijah asks. Sliding his sunglasses on, Darius takes a deep breath, letting it settle in like a man who almost got buried alive. Elijah nods. Well, you just gave them the shovels. Across the street, the media swarm, news vans, live feeds. This is bigger than just two bad cops. This is a system exposed. A reporter shoves a mic forward. Mr. King, what do you have to say about today's verdict? Darius stops. Looks right into the lens. He could go off. He could let the anger spill out. But instead, he keeps it simple. There are good cops out there, he says, his voice steady. But there are also too many who think a badge makes them untouchable. Today, we proved they're not. The reporters keep shouting. But Darius walks away. Some fights aren't won with words. Elijah claps him on the back. Let's get out of here. As they head toward the car, Elijah smirks. So, you think the agency's going to be pissed? Darius chuckles, shaking his head. Oh, they're going to love this mess. They both laugh, sliding into the car. But across the country, people are watching. A mother with two teenage sons. A man who's been stopped too many times. A young rookie officer wondering what kind of cop he wants to be. This wasn't just a trial. It was a warning. Power isn't immunity. And sooner or later, the truth always comes out. Corruption thrives when people stay silent. Share this story. Hold those in power accountable. Because next time, it might not be a CIA agent. Next time, it might be someone with no way out.